Hello, welcome back to the studio. Today we are opening with this footage of my cat helping me paint by stepping all over my watercolor palette and drinking my paint water. This is not only because my cat Neuron is the cutest cat ever, but also because I really want to show any entomologists who might be watching this that I do actually have some minimal understanding of how insects are put together, which is going to be important given some of the terrible bee doodles that I have later on in this video. Today we are doing a first impressions review of the Billy Showell Sennelier palette. I had samples of these colors sent to me by the very generous and wonderful YouTuber Ev Bolt from Bolt's Vault. I'll link her channel. If you're new here, my name is Lee Angold. I'm a botanical and natural science illustrator who, despite the footage that you are about to see, would like to do entomology illustrations sometime. On this channel, I share watercolor techniques and tips and some insights into my daily life as an illustrator. If this is content that you're interested in, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Several weeks ago, I received a care package from my friend Ev. She sent me a number of different watercolor palettes that she had already reviewed on her channel for me to take a look at. Among them was this palette by Billy Showell. Billy Showell is an internationally renowned botanical artist, and I had been very curious about this palette of paints that she put together from the Sennelier line to see how they would work with my techniques, given that I'm also a botanical painter, but I paint in a very different way from Billy Showell. So Ev had poured some of the paint, she bought the set, and then she poured some of the paints into this plastic palette. And she'd also poured in a couple of other paints that she thought complemented it well. The Billy Showell set includes Helios Purple, made with PR122, Rose Madder Lake, made with PV19, so that's a quinacridone version of it's a hue, Alizarin Crimson Lake, made with PR83, so that is original alizarin crimson, which is fugitive. Sennelier Red, made with PR254. Red Orange, which is made with PO43 and PY83. Sennelier Yellow Deep, made with PY83 and PY153. Lemon Yellow, made with PY3. Phthalo Blue, made with PB15:3, French Ultramarine Blue, made with PB29 and PV15, Cobalt Blue, made with PB28, Dioxazine Purple, made with PV23, and a quinacridone gold hue. The Sennelier quinacridone gold hue being made with PR101, PY150, and PR206. Ev added two more colors to the set that she sent me. These are two colors that she felt complemented this. They are Cobalt Teal, made with PG50, and Opera, which is made with PR122 and a fugitive fluorescent pigment. The Opera is actually a color that is not included in this set, but that Billy Showell does say that she uses quite a bit in her own work, so it's just an additional color for her. And then the Cobalt Teal is just another very bright color that goes with this selection of bright colors. This set is interesting because it contains no less than 4 red or magenta colors, 5 if you include the Opera, 1 orange, 3 yellows, 3 blues, a purple, and absolutely no greens or earth tones. Although, like Billy, I do enjoy having a wide range of bright colors, I do usually include some greens in my palette. Again, like Billy, I usually mix most of the greens that you'll see in my finished paintings. However, I like having greens in my palette both to facilitate mixing some brighter greens and also because I do use them quite a bit to neutralize reds. I also usually include some earth tones in my palette. Again, I find them very useful for adding some depth and granulation to some of my other mixes, and I do paint a lot of earthy subjects where having some pre-mixed earth tones does come in handy. So I'm curious to see how these paints behave. So here you're seeing that while I was waiting for the swatches on the left side of my sketchbook spread to dry, I started mixing some colors on the right side to see what kind of greens and neutral colors I could mix. I was fairly satisfied with the greens, although I will note that because the two brighter yellows are both on the relatively opaque side, at least when compared to my favorite yellow, PY150, I did find that the green mixes were a little bit on the opaque side on the palette, which, as you know, I don't like very much. And I could definitely mix a fair range of browns, although I did have trouble mixing any kind of black, which I'll get into a little bit more later on in the video. As I go back to the swatches, I'd like to point out a few things about the paint behavior. I do really want to preface this with saying this is a professional grade paint. It is very bright, very saturated, and I recognize that Billy Showell makes beautiful artwork with it. So this is all just based on how I work and my technique. It doesn't mean that this is bad paint by any means. This is great paint. However, there were a few things that I noticed about paint behavior that I didn't really like. The first one is Sennelier has a sort of sticky feel, and I don't mean this just in terms of honey content. I use quite a few paints that feature honey. I use M. Graham paints as well as Roman Schmal paints, and they contain a lot of honey, and so this isn't strictly just a honey thing, but Sennelier sort of sticks to the brush. It's a weird brush feeling. You kind of have to mix it up on your palette with a fair bit of water for it to release. So that's a sort of interesting thing that I wasn't a huge fan of. I also was surprised by how little it flows. Perhaps I'm used to paints with a little bit more oxgall content, but I guess in my head I had the idea that because Billy Showell uses a lot of wet and wet that she would like really high flow paints, and these are not high flow. They sort of sit where you put them, which perhaps in the context of wet and wet for botanical painting, where she wants them to spread a little but mostly stay put, that is actually ideal. I don't know, it just surprised me. Now in terms of colors, there were a few standouts. The Helios Purple, which is made with one of my favorite pigments, PR122, is a really beautiful version of this pigment. I also really liked this version of Phthalo Blue. It's a very greenish shade of phthalo blue green shade. They do vary a little bit, and I really liked this one. I was curious about the cobalt blue because I collect cobalt blue glassware in my kitchen, but it's never really translated in paint, and it was not actually the cobalt blue, but the French ultramarine blue looks just like that shade of beautiful cobalt glass. Just the addition of that PV15 and a regular PB29 just gives it a real richness. I also really like this version of Dioxazine Purple. It's very dark, very punchy, and the Quin Gold hue is actually a beautiful version. It's a little different from the original PO49 quinacridone gold pigment, but I think I might like it a little bit more. So some really beautiful colors, but I'm not a huge fan of this paint behavior, and the selection of colors would not be my selection. So now let's see how this plays out when I actually go to paint. In my next video, I'm going to take a look at one of Billy Showell's books, which I've also very generously sent to me, and see if this palette works really well if I use her techniques and paint subjects that appeal to her, but for the purposes of this first impressions video, I decided it was a better idea to choose a subject that appealed to me and paint it in my own way and see whether this palette would work for that. So because in my swatches I had such crappy little cartoony bees that I'd drawn in to test for transparency, I decided to do a slightly more developed ink and wash study of a bee. Now this is on cellulose paper in one of my Stillman and Byrne sketchbooks, so it's not going to stand up to a huge amount of glazing. I do know that Sennelier is supposedly known as a brand for being great at glazing. Now, my personal opinion is that that has a lot more to do with pigments than any brand properties. So I'm not really going to worry about that today. Today I'm just going to work on painting this bee. And I'm working with a lot of yellows, which usually would be fine, but again, it's very odd to me because usually my all-purpose yellow is PY150, Nickel Azo yellow, which is extremely transparent, and these other yellows are not. So already my techniques are being a little bit disturbed. And then the other thing is I'm so used to the way I work, the way I choose my palette for any given subject is that I choose my main colors of my subject and then I choose their complements in order to be able to easily mix darks within a very limited palette. And although I have quite a large selection of colors here, none of them mix there is no perfect complementary color, so I'd always have to mix 3 or more colors to get a really dark neutral. Both because nothing is perfectly across the color wheel from each other, and also because these choices are a little bit more opaque, which somewhat surprises me in the context of a botanical palette. I would perhaps expect that there would be more focus on transparency than there is. But again, this is not a criticism of this palette or Billy Showell's work at all. Obviously, she uses this palette to wonderful effect. It's just surprising to me given the way that I work. I'm curious to hear from other artists how you mix darks in your paintings. Do you mix from a primary triad or another triad where you mix 3 colors to get a dark? Do you just use a pre-mixed dark like a neutral tint or a black? Or do you do like me and you mix a lot of colors with their complements? And how important is it for you in your palette to have complements or to have pre-made darks? Would a palette like this Billy Showell palette work for your techniques? Let me know down in the comments below. Here you'll see that I'm continuing on and painting. I do end up putting in a lot more layers than I usually would in this sketchbook. I have had some bad experiences in the past where sometimes if I put in too many layers, then stuff can start lifting up or even shredding the paper. I didn't have any problems like that this time. It isn't a huge amount of layers and I was working pretty dry, but I did find, for example, with the legs of this bee that I couldn't get the darkest value right away, and so I did have to go in 2 or 3 times to get some of the darkest darks and some of the dark areas. So you'll see me going back to the same areas, which again is not something that I would do as much in the context of a sketch. In the context of my finished pieces, I do a lot of glazing. So again, we'll see with my next video when I'm painting a flower and I'm painting it more based on what I learned from Billy Showell's techniques, whether these paints work better for mixing darks or for mixing bright colors. I will say where the brighter yellows that are a little bit more opaque did come in handy was I was finding that the body of my bee was a little bit too dark and brown. and I was able to drop in with the PY3 that lemon yellow. I was able to brighten it up by just dropping some drops of that over top, and because it has a little bit of opacity, it did really brighten it up, whereas if I used a more transparent yellow, it would have just darkened it up even more. So, you know, it's a matter of adjusting how I work. This palette has challenged me a lot more than I thought it would. Just at first impressions of the colors, it didn't really register for me that there weren't any compliments in this palette, and I just saw a bunch of bright colors and I thought, well, they're not exactly the bright colors that I would choose, but they would still work. And even comparing to the very limited palette that I got from Sail Up Paint Company, where, you know, I didn't have very many of the colors that I use at all, this is much closer to the palettes that I use, and yet this has challenged me a lot more. So it's sort of interesting to me how we each react to different palettes. I'm finishing up this painting now, and despite all the challenges along the way, I actually really like how it came out, and I did really enjoy a lot of the colors in this palette. I'm looking forward to seeing how it will behave when I try out using these colors, but following a method more similar to Billy Showell's. If you'd like to see that experiment, I'll be releasing that video next week, so don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so that you'll be notified when my next video comes back out. Bye-bye! See you next week.